It was late in the evening on October 4th, 2023, when Hannah Peterson arrived at the farmhouse that would become her new home. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the Connecticut countryside bathed in a dull, fading twilight. The farmhouse stood alone on a sprawling piece of land, its dark silhouette framed by a dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. There was a chill in the air, the kind that clings to the skin and reminds one that summer had long since passed. Hannah had married Martin Sawyer just 3 months earlier, in what many would call a whirlwind romance. They had met in the summer of 2022, introduced by mutual friends at a small gathering. Martin, a widower, had lost his first wife, Laura, in a tragic accident a few years prior. It was a story Hannah had heard countless times. Laura's death had left Martin alone with his son, Evan, to manage the farmhouse and its many demands. He had described his life as lonely, burdened by the weight of grief and responsibility. As she crossed the threshold into the farmhouse for the first time as a resident, Hannah was greeted by the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards. The air inside was heavy, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. Hannah's son Jacob followed close behind her, his footsteps hesitant. He was only 11 years old, still adjusting to the idea of having a stepfather and a new half-brother. The move had not been easy for him, and the look in his eyes suggested he was already wary of the place. The first few days in the farmhouse passed without incident. Hannah busied herself with unpacking and getting to know the layout of the home, a large 2-story structure with more rooms than they needed. It wasn't until the evening of October 8th, 2023, that Hannah first noticed something unusual. She was putting away dishes in the kitchen when she heard it, a faint noise coming from the basement below. It was a dull, repetitive sound, almost like the scraping of metal against concrete. The clock on the wall read 9:17 post-meridium. Hannah paused, her hand still clutching a plate, as she listened intently. The noise persisted for a few moments, then stopped abruptly, leaving the house in an eerie silence. She shook it off, telling herself it was probably the old furnace or some other benign explanation. But a nagging feeling lingered, an unease she couldn't quite shake. Evan, Martin's son, was an enigma. 15 years old, he rarely spoke and often kept to himself. Hannah had noticed early on that he spent most of his time in the basement. On one occasion, she saw him descend the narrow staircase with a book in hand, only to reappear hours later, his face unreadable. She had asked Martin about it, but he had dismissed her concerns, explaining that Evan had always been a quiet, introspective child, especially after losing his mother. Still, there was something about the boy that unsettled her. He moved through the house like a shadow, almost as if he were trying not to be seen. And then there were the nights when the strange noises from the basement grew louder, more persistent. On October 12th, 2023, Hannah was awoken by a loud thud that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. She checked the clock. It was 2:43 ante-meridium. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving her heart pounding in the silence. Hannah began to grow concerned. The noises from the basement were becoming a regular occurrence, always at odd hours of the night. When she mentioned it to Martin, he brushed it off, saying it was probably just the old pipes settling or Evan working on one of his many projects. But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something Martin wasn't telling her. The farmhouse itself seemed to harbor secrets. Hannah had found an old photograph in the attic one afternoon, a picture of Martin, Laura, and a much younger Evan, all smiling for the camera. There was something in Laura's eyes that caught her attention, a sadness that didn't match the joy on her face. It was as if she were hiding something, a secret that had stayed with the house long after she was gone. As the days passed, Hannah's unease grew. Jacob, too, had begun to change. He had always been a quiet child, but now there was a tension in him that hadn't been there before. He avoided the basement entirely, and when asked why, he would only shrug and say it made him feel weird. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jacob mentioned hearing whispers coming from the basement. Hannah's heart skipped a beat, but she forced a smile, not wanting to alarm him. By October 18th, 2023, Hannah had reached her breaking point. The noises, the unease, the strange behavior from both Evan and Jacob, it was all too much. She decided she needed to know what was going on in that basement, no matter what. As she descended the narrow staircase, flashlight in hand, the air grew colder, heavier, and the metallic scent she had noticed before grew stronger. Her pulse quickened with each step, the darkness below swallowing her whole. She reached the bottom and shone the light around the room. It was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and tools, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then she noticed it, a small door, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. It was locked with a heavy padlock, the metal rusty and worn. Hannah felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the door, an ominous feeling settling in her gut. Hannah stood in the dimly lit basement, the beam of her flashlight flickering as it danced across the cold concrete floor. The small door she had discovered days earlier, locked and hidden behind crates, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was October 19th, 2023, just after 10 post-meridiem, and the house above her was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling into the night. Over the past week, Hannah's unease had deepened. The strange noises from the basement had grown louder, more insistent, almost as if something beneath the floorboards was trying to claw its way to the surface. Each night, she would wake in the early hours, her heart pounding as she strained to listen in the dark. The clock would read 2 ante-meridiem, sometimes 3 ante-meridiem, and always the faint scraping or whispering would begin. Martin's reassurances no longer comforted her. In fact, they only fueled her suspicions that he was hiding something. Earlier that evening, Hannah had decided she could no longer ignore the locked door. While Martin was out running errands, she had searched through the house, her hands trembling as she sifted through drawers and cabinets. Finally, tucked away in an old tool chest in the garage, she found what she was looking for. A rusty key, small and unassuming, but heavy with the weight of what it might unlock. Now, standing in front of the door, Hannah hesitated. The key felt cold in her hand, almost like an omen. She glanced back at the staircase, half expecting to see Evan watching her from the shadows, but the basement remained empty. Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud, rusty click that echoed through the basement, making her jump. She paused, waiting, but the house remained still. With a sense of dread, she slowly opened the door. The smell hit her first, a pungent metallic odor that made her stomach churn. The room beyond was small, cramped, with walls lined in what appeared to be dark stains. Her flashlight revealed a set of shelves filled with jars, each containing something she couldn't quite identify in the dim light. At the center of the room was an old wooden table, its surface scarred and worn, as if it had seen years of rough use. On the floor beside it, chains were bolted to the concrete, rusted and heavy. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just a storage room. It was something far more sinister. The images of the stains on the walls and the chains on the floor burned into her mind, each detail adding to the growing sense of horror that gripped her. She stepped back, the flashlight shaking in her hand as she turned to leave, but her foot caught on something. She looked down to see a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age, lying just inside the door. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, and the first few pages were filled with disjointed thoughts, confessions of guilt, and pleas for forgiveness. As she read further, she realized the notebook belonged to Laura, Martin's first wife. The entries were erratic, detailing her growing fear of someone, or something, in the house. She wrote of hearing voices, of seeing shadows that shouldn't be there, and of Martin's increasing obsession with the basement. The last entry, dated August 15th, 2020, spoke of Laura's intention to confront Martin about whatever he was hiding, to demand the truth once and for all. Hannah's mind raced. She knew Laura had died in what was officially ruled as an accidental fall down the stairs, but the details in the notebook suggested otherwise. Was it possible that Martin had something to do with her death? Or was Laura's fear a result of her own deteriorating mental state, a descent into paranoia that led to her tragic end? The questions swirled in Hannah's mind, but one thing was certain. The answers lay in the basement, in the secrets she had just uncovered. As she backed out of the small room, Hannah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to confront Martin, but how? And what would she say? The fear of what might happen next gripped her, but she also felt a strange determination, a need to uncover the full truth, no matter the cost. She made her way up the stairs, her thoughts racing, trying to piece together the fragments of the dark puzzle she had stumbled upon. When Martin returned later that night, just after midnight, Hannah was waiting for him in the kitchen, her hands still cold from the basement's chill. She watched him closely, every movement, every word, searching for any sign of guilt. But Martin was as calm and composed as ever, his demeanor unchanged. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. But Hannah knew she couldn't ignore what she had found. The locked door, the notebook, the strange noises. It all pointed to something dark, something she couldn't turn away from. As she lay in bed that night, the familiar sounds began again, but this time they didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with the noise. Hannah clenched her fists under the covers, knowing that whatever was hidden in the basement wouldn't stay hidden for long. The night of October 20th, 2023, began like many others, quiet, with the farmhouse settling into the kind of stillness that only comes in the dead of night. Hannah lay awake in bed, the weight of what she had discovered pressing down on her like a physical burden. The notebook, now hidden beneath her mattress, felt like a ticking time bomb. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the words scrawled in Laura's frantic handwriting, each page pulling her deeper into the abyss of her predecessor's fears. At 1:30 ante-meridiem, Hannah heard the sound she had come to dread, the low, rhythmic scraping from the basement. But this time, it was different. The noise was louder, more deliberate, as if something or someone was trying to get out. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she sat up in bed, straining to listen. The noise continued, unwavering, filling the silence of the house. She glanced at Martin, who was sound asleep beside her, oblivious to the disturbance. Hannah's heart pounded as she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. Descending the stairs in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The farmhouse, with its creaking floors and shadowed corners, felt more sinister than ever. By the time she reached the basement door, her hands were trembling. She hesitated, listening as the sound grew louder with each passing second. She had to know what was behind that door. The answer to everything, the strange noises, Laura's death, the locked room, was right there, just beneath her feet. With a deep breath, Hannah opened the basement door and flicked on the light. The stairs groaned under her weight as she descended, the air growing colder with each step. The smell, the same metallic odor from before, grew stronger, assaulting her senses. At the bottom of the stairs, she turned toward the small room she had discovered the night before, the door now slightly ajar. She hadn't left it that way. Her pulse quickened as she approached, the light from her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside the room, the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. The shelves that had once held jars were now bare, the jars themselves shattered on the floor, their contents spilled across the concrete. But it wasn't the broken glass or the stains that caught her attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. Evan. He stood motionless, his back to her, facing the old wooden table. Hannah's heart skipped a beat as she realized he was holding something in his hands, something small and metallic that glinted in the beam of her flashlight. Slowly, Evan turned to face her, his eyes wide and unblinking, his expression a blank slate. In his hands he held a rusted chain, the same one she had seen bolted to the floor the night before. The metal links clinked softly as they swung back and forth. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a voice that sent chills down her spine, Evan spoke, not to her, but to someone who wasn't there. "I told you she would find us," he whispered, his gaze shifting to the shadows that clung to the walls. "I told you she wouldn't leave us alone." Hannah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She knew she should run, should get out of that basement as fast as possible, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The realization hit her like a freight train. Evan wasn't alone in that room. The presence she had felt, the one that had been haunting her since she moved into the farmhouse, was real. And it was standing right next to him. The next few moments passed in a blur. Evan dropped the chain and lunged toward her, his movements quick and erratic. Hannah stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The basement plunged into darkness, the only sound the frantic beating of her heart. She scrambled to her feet, her hands searching for the door as Evan's footsteps closed in behind her. She could hear him breathing, feel the cold air on the back of her neck as he reached out for her. Somehow, she managed to find the door and slam it shut behind her, the bolt sliding into place with a loud, final click. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she listened to the sound of Evan's fists pounding against the wood from the other side. "You can't leave us!" he screamed, the sound muffled but filled with a desperation that made Hannah's skin crawl. "You're just like her! You'll never leave us!" Her hands shook as she locked the basement door and backed away, her mind racing. She had to get to Jacob, had to get them both out of the house before it was too late. As she stumbled up the stairs, she realized that everything Laura had written in her notebook was true. The voices, the shadows, the fear. Evan wasn't just haunted by his mother's death. He was possessed by it. When she reached Jacob's room, the clock on the wall read 2:45 ante-meridiem. He was sound asleep, oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded downstairs. Hannah shook him awake, her voice trembling as she urged him to get dressed. There was no time to explain, no time to gather their things. They had to leave now. As they hurried down the stairs, Hannah cast one last glance at the basement door. The pounding had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a shroud. But she knew it wasn't over. Whatever was in that basement wasn't going to let them go without a fight. She pulled Jacob toward the front door, her mind focused on one thing: escape. The truth about Martin, about Laura's death, about Evan and the basement, could wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting out of that house alive. The air outside the farmhouse was frigid as Hannah pulled Jacob through the front door, the cold biting at their skin. It was 3:05 ante-meridiem on October 21st, 2023, and the darkness seemed to swallow the world beyond the porch. Hannah's breath formed clouds in the crisp air as she fumbled with the car keys, her hands shaking from fear and adrenaline. Every second felt like an eternity as she glanced back at the house, half expecting to see Evan, or whatever he had become, emerging from the shadows. The car's engine roared to life, a sudden, deafening sound in the silence of the night. Hannah urged Jacob into the passenger seat, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, expecting the worst. As she put the car in reverse, her heart pounding in her chest, she saw movement, a figure darting through the living room window. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized it was Martin. He stood at the window, his face obscured by the darkness inside the house. For a moment, Hannah wondered if he had any idea of what had happened, if he was as much a victim of the house's horrors as she was. But then she remembered the notebook, the locked door, and the secrets that Martin had kept hidden from her since the day they met. There was no time to think, no time to question. She had to get away. But as she shifted the car into drive, the engine sputtered and died, plunging them back into silence. Hannah's pulse raced as she turned the key again, but the car refused to start. Panic set in as she realized they were trapped, the farmhouse looming behind them like a predator waiting to strike. She turned to Jacob, trying to keep her voice steady, urging him to stay calm, but she could see the fear in his eyes, mirroring her own. The door to the house creaked open, and Hannah's heart dropped. Martin stepped out onto the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't seem surprised to see them, didn't shout or run after them. Instead, he simply stood there watching, as if he was waiting for something. The calmness in his demeanor was more terrifying than if he had been furious. It was the calm of a man who had nothing left to lose, who knew something she didn't. Hannah's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. The keys in her hand felt useless, and the darkness of the night pressed in on them from all sides. She thought of the basement, of Evan's crazed eyes, and of the chains bolted to the floor. She thought of Laura, trapped in her own home, unable to escape the terror that had consumed her. And then it hit her. Martin wasn't coming for them. He was waiting for them to come back. Because whatever was in that basement wasn't finished with them yet. She reached across the seat, grabbing Jacob's hand, and opened the car door. They couldn't stay here, not with Martin watching them like a hunter with his prey in sight. They needed to hide, to get away from the house and into the cover of the trees. The forest surrounding the farmhouse, once foreboding, now seemed like their only hope. It was a chance, a slim one, but it was better than waiting to be caught. As they bolted from the car, Hannah felt the cold air sting her lungs, her feet slipping on the damp ground. Jacob stumbled beside her, but she tightened her grip on his hand, pulling him along. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of darkness that promised concealment. Behind them, she could hear Martin's footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, following them into the night. They plunged into the trees, the branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, masking the noise of their pursuer. Hannah's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't dare look back, couldn't bear to see how close Martin was, or if Evan had joined him in the chase. All that mattered was moving forward, deeper into the woods, away from the horrors of the house. But the forest, too, seemed alive with malice. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves felt like an omen, as if the darkness itself was conspiring against them. Hannah's mind raced, the images of the basement flashing before her eyes, the chains, the stains, the notebook filled with Laura's desperate scrawls. She realized that whatever had consumed Laura, whatever had driven Evan to madness, was not confined to the walls of the farmhouse. It was with them, in the air they breathed, in the ground they ran upon. There was no escaping it. There, just as she felt her strength waning, a hand closed around her wrist, yanking her backward. Hannah screamed, twisting in the grip, but it wasn't Martin who had caught her. It was Evan, his eyes wild with a mix of terror and madness. His grip tightened, pulling her close as he whispered frantically, his words barely audible over the pounding of her heart. But there was no time to listen, no time to understand. She pushed him away, her mind focused solely on Jacob, who had stopped a few feet ahead, frozen in fear. Before she could reach him, she heard a voice, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. It came from behind her, from the direction of the farmhouse, echoing through the trees like a death knell. She didn't need to turn around to know what it was. She could feel it, the presence that had haunted them from the moment they set foot in that house. It was coming for them, relentless and unstoppable, and they had nowhere left to run. Dawn broke over the Connecticut countryside on October 21st, 2023, with the first rays of sunlight piercing through the dense canopy of trees. The farmhouse stood silent, its shadow stretching long across the frost-covered ground. Hannah stumbled out of the woods, her breath ragged, her clothes torn and dirty. She clutched Jacob's hand tightly, the warmth of his small fingers the only thing keeping her grounded in the reality of what they had just survived. It was 6:45 ante-meridiem when Hannah finally reached the edge of the forest, the farmhouse now a distant dark silhouette behind her. The night had felt endless, a nightmare that refused to end. But the rising sun brought with it a cold clarity, a harsh reminder of the horrors that still lingered in the shadows. She knew that whatever evil had been unleashed in that basement was not bound to the walls of the farmhouse. It had followed them, haunting their every step through the woods. And now, even with the sun up, its presence lingered. Hannah and Jacob stumbled onto the dirt road, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. In the distance, she saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser, its presence both a relief and a reminder of the grim reality they were about to face. She had no idea how long they had been running or how they had managed to survive the night, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was that they were alive, scarred, but alive. The officers arrived at the scene around 7:15 ante-meridiem, the sun fully risen by then, casting a harsh light on the farmhouse. As Hannah and Jacob were led into the back of the cruiser, she looked back one last time. The house stood ominous and still, its secrets hidden away once more. Whatever had happened there, whatever had driven Evan to madness, would soon be uncovered. But Hannah knew in her heart that some things would never be fully understood. By 9 ante-meridiem, the police had begun their investigation. Inside the farmhouse, they found the basement door hanging open, the lock broken, and the room beyond in disarray. The chains on the floor, the shattered jars, the stained walls, it all pointed to a place of torment and suffering. But of Martin and Evan, there was no sign. The house was empty, silent, as if it had swallowed them whole. Hannah and Jacob were taken to the hospital for evaluation. The doctors noted their physical injuries, scratches, bruises, signs of exhaustion, but the real damage was psychological. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over, that the darkness from the basement had seeped into her soul. Jacob, too, remained quiet, his eyes distant, as if he had seen something in those woods that he couldn't put into words. The notebook, now in the hands of the police, became a crucial piece of evidence. It told the story of Laura's descent into fear, of her discovery of something monstrous lurking in the basement, and of her final desperate attempts to escape it. The last entry was dated August 15, 2020, just days before her death. The investigators pieced together what they could, but there were gaps, parts of the story that would never be fully known. As the investigation continued, the farmhouse was sealed off, declared a crime scene. Rumors spread through the small town, each more gruesome than the last. Some said the house was cursed, that the spirits of the dead still roamed its halls. Others whispered that Martin had been involved in something dark, something that had ultimately consumed him and his son. But for Hannah, there were no answers, only the haunting memories of that night. She and Jacob moved away, far from the farmhouse and the town, hoping to leave the past behind. Yet, every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the sound of chains rattling in the basement, could still feel the cold air of the forest on her skin. She knew that the darkness they had escaped would always be with them, a shadow that would never fully fade. As the months passed, the farmhouse remained abandoned, a relic of a dark history that no one dared to revisit. It stood as a silent sentinel over the land, its secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting for the next unlucky soul to uncover them. And though the police never found Martin or Evan, the townspeople knew better than to question it. Some things, they said, were better left undisturbed.